Friends, get ready for a sick video because I'm literally sick as I'm recording this. At a first glance, this might look like an ordinary Jeep, but the amount of aftermarket is telling a different story. The thing is, this model is gonna be an accessory to my Sturmtiger in a big diorama, but I got carried away with my seriousness and all of a sudden, it's a full-blown project all on its own. Ironically, the kit comes with a driver that looks pretty nice, and the pose is almost identical to the Alpine figure. And because I don't know anything about soft skin models, I'm gonna follow the instructions religiously. Okay, so up to this point I've built exactly 3 models that are not armored and don't have any tracks, and I'm starting to see a pattern here. Every build starts with the chassis and the running gear. I mean, it makes sense because it's a base and the rest of the model is built upon it. Most of the kit parts are contained here, but very little of it will be visible in the end. So what it means in practice is no fancy techniques here, just some honest cleanup work and making sure that everything fits correctly. But immediately we're met with a pleasant job, because that's how I can describe the resin wheels from this model. There's pretty much no cleanup, the sack is realistic, and details are beautiful. They fit rather loosely, so I'll have to keep them aside until the model is totally finished. One thing where I like to waste my time is the engines on these models. They're never visible unless you open the hood or something, but I just like to have a good time and glue some parts together. No cleanup, no fuss, just good vibes. The only modification here was drilling out the opening on the exhaust pipe. Each time I build something like this, I have no idea how so many small and weird parts will fit together and what will come out of it, but somehow it always works out. My tank brain would call this part the upper hull, but it's definitely not called like that, and I'm just too stubborn to look it up, but this part was giving me some resistance. Another big difference here is that if some panel doesn't fit well, you can't hide it with weld beads. And if you mess up something on the chassis, there's a good chance it'll have a negative impact on the rest of the build. But these are not problems for us on this channel. We see them as opportunities for cool techniques. So after I sanded and polished the problematic area, I filled it with, wait for it, Mr. Surfacer 500. I was surprised how fast it dries and how easy it is to sand it to a perfectly smooth finish. I'll probably start using it more often on my armor models as well. But as I said, I haven't used it for that purpose yet, but I used it for something else. Closing gaps and making them smoother. Now, why would you want to close a nice gap like that, you might ask? Well, it's because the pin wash will flow much better now and the painted finish will be more unified. In my opinion, small efforts like these separate those models that were just hastily slapped together from those where some thought and care was involved. So with the main assembly finished, let's do some interesting stuff. The Voyager photo etch set is really extensive, and I ended up using only a fraction of it. I only used those reflectors because I destroyed the original ones in the sanding process. In some cases, the Legend stowage set is more useful than photo etch and kit parts, such as this jerry can with a landmine strapped to it. The main reason I wanted to use photo etch was the folding roof frame. I think it's better to replicate it from metal pieces just like on the real Jeep, rather than trying to glue and clean up the plastic pieces from the kit. I didn't do a perfect job, and the 2 parts are not entirely identical, but it's still much better than the original pieces, and any imperfections will be hidden with stowage. This was the most complicated part of the model, but all it needed was patience. And of course a good superglue and debonder combo, courtesy of VMS. And you can get your own ultimate weapons against photo etch if you follow the links and use coupons in the video description. This is pretty much all the photo etch I employed. Not much, but it improves the model a lot. I also did a bit of 3D printing on my new 16K Elegoo Saturn Magic Machine from the future. The 50 cal in the kit is acceptable if you squint both of your eyes. The replacement from Legend is better, but nothing beats the detail of the 3D printed one from Faustus Models on Colts 3D. I'll leave you a link for his profile down below as well, because he does some incredible stuff. And you'll find an affiliate Elegoo link there too, which applies to anything from Elegoo, not just this specific printer. 3D printed details can become tricky if they're too detailed. I don't know if having too much detail is a thing, but you know what I mean. They can be delicate and fragile. However, these 3D files are a worthy investment because you can buy them once and you can print infinite copies for your projects. Despite how awesome the machine gun looked, you'll see in the end that I didn't use it on the finished model, but I'll talk more about it at the end of the video. I mean, it looks awesome at this point, but we'll make it even better. You see, the Legend set is not just about stowage, it's also a partial conversion because it comes with a field radio. It's a big box with tons of details and it also changes the silhouette of the Jeep a little bit. I was actually shocked how much stuff goes into this part, and after looking up photos of the real thing, I also added the power cables which are not mentioned in the instructions, but the coolest part is definitely the coiled wire for the headphones. It looks awesome, doesn't it? Let's now make the Jeep loaded and absolutely goated. I love how the Legend sets add tons of stowage and show it off in very creative ways on the box art, so I took a lot of inspiration from there. Some parts are easy because they're just laying around in the back, and I made it even easier for me when I glued them together into more manageable subassemblies. I also employed some spare 3D prints for my previous projects, such as these captured German potato mashers in a bucket. Note that I didn't employ any tarps made from two-part putty. And because the US Army is celebrating not only the destruction of the Sturmtiger, but probably also the capture of the entire town, so I added some Chateau Sauvignon. Another fun job is adding straps to these backpacks. Lead foil strips are excellent, but you know what? Not everyone has them, and thin strips of Tamiya tape are more accessible, and you can buy them in appropriate thicknesses, saving a lot of time you'd otherwise spend cutting. And to save my nerves with the front windshield and clear parts, I decided to replace the whole thing with this resin pancake where the windshield is covered in a protective wrap. This part also includes a rolled up camouflage net, which is depicted the usual way. When you're making resin accessories, you gotta make some compromises if you want to cast them successfully. So I decided to enhance it with small pieces of gauze soaked in leveling thinner and diluted PVA glue. This way it's very easy to fold it exactly to your liking, and once the glue dries, the entire thing will be rock solid. I treated the protective rope in a similar manner, soaking it with diluted superglue so it would become less absorbent and easier to paint. And finally, the Alpine figure comes in 3 parts, and there were absolutely no problems with it. I was worried how it would fit, suspecting that it was designed for a Tamiya kit, not a Takom one, but surprisingly, everything fits like a dream, and this is quite amazing because the pose is quite complicated. And that about does it as far as the construction goes. The only reason I'm not ending here is because I found it impossible to dry assemble the model without it looking funky, so let's now wash it and start painting. After the obligatory bath in soapy water and a soft paintbrush treatment, I blasted everything with alcohol which removes grease from the surface. The main body is jammed in the octopus painting stand, and the rest is superglued on toothpicks for easy handling. Now I'm gonna try the newest addition to the VMS primer range. Tank green might look like a weird color at first, but it's great for every model in greenish tones. Hard to reach areas won't stand out like a sore thumb, and it's not as drastic as, let's say, black or dark brown primer. You can try it out with the same links as I gave you with the superglue and debonder. For the main color, I went with my favorite faded olive drab from AK, with a bit of clear varnish from Tamiya to saturate the paint. Here we can see how those hard to reach areas look like with the dark green undercoat. I mean, it's not like I kept them like that. I like to go over the entire model from different angles to ensure nice paint coverage, but it just goes to show that if there's some nasty spot, it's still gonna look pretty nice, like a very dark green shadow. For this model, I decided to go back in time and employ a little bit of post shading. It's not the same extreme method I used to work with a year ago, this time it's more of a zenithal light approach. Basically just adding some lighter colors from the top and on the exposed edges. Very quick, simple, and most importantly, subtle. Once the model is finished, you won't even notice the effect. I partially used it because at first, I wasn't sure how light I wanted the Jeep to be, so this gave me some wiggle room. The only decals I used were the numbers on the sides of the hood. I had to get rid of the USA part because that would be hidden under the tarp, and with some persuasion, they landed exactly where I wanted them, even though the tarp was against the idea. I didn't have to clear coat the paint underneath because it was already glossy. And to knock that sheen down and unify everything, a generous layer of VMS satin varnish was applied over the entire model. The satin surface is very subtle, it looks almost flat, but the slight sheen is noticeable under certain angles. But the base coating process isn't over yet, we're just switching to water-based acrylics and paintbrushes. The exact paints aren't really important, the only objective here is to introduce some color variation between the individual parts. This is not some forced contrast nonsense, just a regular thing. Jerry cans and other additional pieces could, and most likely did have, different shades of olive drab and green. And you know how it goes with American tools. They were painted as well. This is all quick and the results are immediate. At this point, I also wanted to get the headlights out of the way. The insides were painted with AK Super Chrome, and then the clear parts were carefully dry fitted. Luckily, they all fall into place without any problems. I simply fixed them in place with Tamiya's clear varnish, and with that, the basic painting was done. Some of the contrasts are subtle, others not so much, but if we're building the most goated Jeep ever, we have to make some bold choices. Moving on, the first fun step is a pin wash, and as always now, it'll be painted with an oil paint. This means we have to let it drain from excess oil for at least an hour. Jeep is an extremely complex model. Everywhere you look, there's a tight corner, a panel line, some kind of handle or a switch, tons of delicate stuff, you name it. That's an absolute pin washing playground right there, and even though the model is tiny, this step will take some time. For example, I did all of the initial painting in one afternoon, but the pin wash took me an entire day for some reason. Luckily, the satin varnish makes the job easier. But that's not entirely true, is it? Because if you remember correctly, we applied the different shades after the varnish, which means the jerry cans and other details have a matte finish, and here the oil paint will bite much quicker, becoming harder to blend properly. So if you do something similar on your models, keep that in mind. Oh, and when I said that the only decals on this model were the numbers, I completely forgot that dashboard is cluttered with them. But, you know, they're so small and so easy to miss, so please forgive me that I forgot about them on my own model. Anyway, the wash is now done and everything is beautifully outlined. Suddenly, all that filling with Mr. Surfacer paid off big time, because it was a pleasure to apply this technique. The next step should be chipping, right? Well, not quite. I wanted to have fun with something else, so instead I focused on the stowage glued on toothpicks. For now, I won't give you any exact paint callouts because I still believe they're not very important, and I'll always encourage everyone to develop their own unique color palette. I mean, my detail painting is far from perfect, but with these small parts, it's so tempting to just quickly paint them in some basic color, slap a pin wash on top of that, and call it quits. But if you spend time, look up some reference images, and paint every detail on those details with care, it'll show. Okay, so let's start with the serious painting, and let's start it simple. The reflective elements are super easy. A silver base coat covered with a thick drop of clear red. Not much to it, and it looks cool. Wooden handles. Again, fairly easy if you use the right colors. These were most likely painted with olive drab as well, but I like to change up their appearance on every US model I build, because these surfaces are just really exciting. Some diluted reddish glazes can give them a wood-stained look, and a bit of that oil paint we use for the pin wash will add extra punch to them. Check out how I added a few light scuffs on the metal parts and how they work with the rust-colored oils, but we'll look at this method later. Leather buckles. I'm not saying that these came out the best, but it's the same approach and color palette I use all the time. I like to push their highlights into orange colors, and the most important thing about leather is to outline the edges with a very light tone, imitating worn and scratched leather. Backpacks and pouches. This is where the color palette becomes more extensive. I find it easier to first paint them in the actual color, like that's supposed to be the real color of the fabric, and then darken it with diluted black-brown glazes and washes. This way, we can introduce a bit of color modulation as well, creating shadow gradients towards the bottom half if we need to. Outlining all of the seam lines and other details is super important for that crisp, well-defined look. And a thicker paint is better for this because it's easier to apply precisely. Then we add the highlights, starting with the basic color again, and then painting smaller and smaller patches with continuously lighter tones. Those outlined seam lines are now picked out with a thick pale color, and this is the lightest tone I use on each piece. The final glaze can not only tone the contrast down to a more reasonable level, but it can also shift the tone more to your liking. It's a technique where I still have lots to learn, especially when it comes to fine painting, because when I'm looking at the results with my own eyes, when the model is on the workbench, it all looks great, but photos and video always show that the technique is still quite rough. On the other hand, I'm satisfied that this approach gives me consistent results and I know what to expect in the end. A rope bumper thing. This one was simple, but time-consuming. At first, I flooded the entire rope with a dark brown color. Then I picked out each coil strand with lighter tones. I used 2 highlights for maximum 3D effect and it was all really satisfying, but again, kinda slow. Once I was done highlighting, I applied a few glazes over the whole part to tie things together. The camouflage net was painted using the same colors and methods, but this was the truly laborious part. This thing alone took me several hours to finish, and one reason for that is because I could barely see the individual strands. You know what, maybe next time I shouldn't be afraid to use the good old dry brushing method for the first layer of highlights. You know, to pick out the shapes and contours, and then, once everything is easy to read, go over the individual details with a fine brush and lighter colors. To sum it up, I focused the lightest tones towards the top of the roll for a more 3D effect, and as usual, tied it all together with a few diluted glazes in the end. Let me know your thoughts because I'm curious to know if there's a better technique for these nets. Now for some subtle scuffing. That's right, not exactly chipping because I wanted to keep this Jeep relatively fresh. And after studying countless reference images of all those ammo cans, radio sets, helmets and whatnot, I noticed that military gear gets often scuffed up, but not entirely beaten up. Of course, I added a few steel chips on the most exposed areas, but those were really just a handful. Instead, I employed a bit of that rusty oil paint to add more depth to the finish, and to also replicate reality, because this is exactly what I noticed in those photos of old military gear, and it looked so interesting. And finally, tires. If you're tired after all this detail painting, you're not alone, but I won't tire you for much longer. Even though I'm not painting too many wheeled vehicles, I already have a simple workflow for maximum visual interest on rubber. A rubber black base coat, followed by a diluted wash with a lighter gray color. It's quick and the results are subtle yet very interesting. Okay, now we can break all of those individual pieces off and glue them to the model, because what follows next is weathering, and this applies to every part of the Jeep, not just the main body. Even though a part of me wanted to call it done at this point, because the model looked so interesting already and there was a lot of stuff to take in, but from the beginning I knew what I wanted. Smooth, stylistic painting on one hand, balanced by gritty and realistic weathering on the other, so let's see how that went. As usual, I started with the AK acrylic mud paste. By the way, if you feel like pretty much everything on this model is done with AK products, then you're not mistaken, and I have an affiliate link in the video description, so if you buy something through there, a small portion of the sales goes to me, and it helps me big time. And there's also a sales coupon for you. After the paste was dry, I went over the model with gouache paint. This is an acrylic dust color which can be blended with water at any point, even like weeks or months later. It always dries to a completely matte finish, and it's honestly a great tool. I was strictly following reference photos for the weathering. I found a couple of muddy jeeps from military reenactments and also one historical photo where the jeep is completely bogged down. And because the diorama will be taking place in February 1945, mud is not just expected but required. One thing about gouache is that it looks different when it's wet and when it dries. So it's good to wait, take a look, and adjust it further with a second pass of blending. Next up, enamel dust with a touch of texture. VMS pigment texture has neutral color but adds volume and enhances the matte finish. I used this grayish dust mixture to add more opacity and smoothness to the effect. That might sound counterproductive, but the thing about satin finishes is that they make blending of acrylic paints and gouaches more difficult, as the watery substance beads up thanks to the higher surface tension. Enamels don't have this issue, so they're easier to control and thus ideal for small corrections. Not to mention how amazing they are for speckling effects and various splatters of dried mud. This is where we start building up that extremely gritty weathering effect. Thanks to the low surface tension and excellent flow, they can be used as dusty washes around small details, such as the logos on the tires. And finally, dark mud. This was hands down the most fun part of the weathering process, and I started working on it after 2 days of high fever. But at this point, I finally felt better, or rather I didn't feel absolutely miserable, and I was able to again sit at the workbench and focus on the work for several hours without taking a break. Again, I followed reference images very closely for maximum authenticity, and let me tell you, wheels are more fun than tracks. It's less work and the effects are very exciting. Or maybe it's just a novelty that will eventually wear off. According to reference images, most of the wet mud is always contained under the mudguards, which makes total sense because that's their purpose, duh. And if you made it this far in the video, I must tell you that I also have merch, which you'll find down in the description again. The most prominent effect here is the dark mud splatters. And it should go without saying that the previous layer of dry enamel earth needs at least half a day to fully cure, ideally longer. Me becoming sick meant that the dust could dry for 2.5 days, so there were no issues here. But I did the speckling in 2 stages. With the first one, I gently dragged the splatters down with a flat brush, slightly moistened in thinner. This is an effect I must start employing more often because it looks absolutely amazing. And then I added another round, this time more restrained. And these splatters will remain the way they are, like no blending. The result will have more depth, and the added complexity makes it really interesting to look at. Once this was all done, it was time to finally attach the wheels. Here I don't know about any proven tricks or techniques, so to make sure each wheel is straight and the sagged portion is at the bottom, I just eyeball everything and make quick adjustments while the glue is still somewhat soft, and I check the result on a flat, sturdy surface. The key is that the wheels must be straight in all directions, and it's not always easy to achieve that when the fit is loose or the axles are glued incorrectly, but with the wheels attached, it was time to add some finishing touches. This meant increasing the contrast in a few places with more dark earth tones, or applying a dark wash in those spots where you have deep gaps casting shadows. Stuff like this tidies up the finished model and makes it look more refined and realistic. The last major part was the driver's figure. Here I went with my usual approach, black and white pre-shading with an airbrush and then glazing for the main colors. Once the basic tone is established and it has enough opacity, I outline the details with a slightly thicker mixture of black and brown, and once these are done, I dilute the mixture further and apply it in the shadowed areas. This way, the shadows will become deeper and the contrast sharper. Then I do the same thing, but with highlights, which make the contrast even better and allow you to reach in places where the airbrush couldn't go. And just like with the dark thick paint, we do the same with the highlight color, but on the protruding parts of the details, enhancing their 3D appearance. It's a method that I've been using for years and the results are always kinda the same, which is exactly what I like about them. Fitting him in place when everything is painted was slightly trickier, but ultimately he looks comfortable and happy, even though his face is telling a different story. Finally, I made an antenna made from a stretched sprue, held in place with superglue, and painted with a dark grey acrylic. And with that out of the way, my mission was over. So, my friends, did you miss me? Or in the meantime, you forgot that I existed? The truth is, after the weekly videos with the Sturmtiger, I really wore myself out. So even though I started working on the model immediately after I finished the previous video and completed the build in 1 week, I took things at a more relaxed pace. As it turns out, if you load your model with so much stowage, it'll take you significantly longer to finish. Who would have thought, right? Anyway, my original plan was to make the most brutal Jeep you've ever seen, loaded with gear and protective armor around the cabin. But that's when my plans started changing. For example, the driver's knee is sticking out of the Jeep, so that meant no armor. I thought the armored cab would solve my problem with the windshield, but once that went out of the window, I had to solve it with the large tarp on the hood. And the 50 cal, no matter how amazing it looked, would probably obscure the entire figure. You see, I don't know yet how the Jeep is gonna be oriented in the diorama, but my initial plan is to display it from the back, and the driver will be looking at soldiers standing on the Sturmtiger. If I added the machine gun, you wouldn't see the driver, and thus the story of the diorama would become more difficult to understand. But now that we are done with the Jeep, it's time to finally put the diorama together. Also, check the Jeep on my personal webpage where I have all of my models, and most of them are already sold. Until next time, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found this video helpful or interesting. I wouldn't be able to run my channel full time without my patrons. Their help allows me to buy more aftermarket than I actually need, and if you're one of them, thank you so much, because if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be making these videos for a living. My Patreon is honestly the best place where only the coolest kids come to hang out. I post regular updates, share work in progress photos, various thoughts and observations from the workbench, and we keep in touch through DMs, comments, and emails. Top tier patrons get early access to all of my videos, completely ad-free, and they stay there forever, so if you like listening to them while you're modeling, that's the #1 spot for you. There are also bonus extras like 3D printable parts for your own projects, reference photos from real-life locations, and high-res studio photos of my models that show way more detail than video ever could. Your financial support is appreciated, but never expected. The diorama is gonna be quite large, so I'll break it into 2 videos, and the first one will be all about the building that will act as a background to the scene. And remember, build your models, don't just hoard them. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!